talk about the mental health issues related to adoption, infertility, as well as family. These are, I want to say they're big topics, but they're like really big topics. So take us from the beginning. How did you get involved in these three different areas and why?
Well, the road to adoption began with infertility. So we knew when we were married that I had issues and I was undergoing treatment. And we started treatment, but then a surprise, we did get pregnant and had a beautiful baby girl. But then adding to our family proved kind of impossible at that point. Time had gone by and I was a little bit older. So we went down the adoption road again and decided to go the international route. So it was, I said that in about 30 seconds, but it was really about a 10-year time period.
So when you decided to go down the adoption route, what kind of questions did you have for yourself, or maybe what kind of expectations were you trying to establish at that point?
Well, we began researching and asking questions and connecting with professionals. And the first decision, we actually went down a couple of roads, but we made the decision to adopt internationally because I, just by happenstance, I saw an article about children attending a summer camp from Mexico. They were from Mexico, staying in our Philadelphia area. And the article ended with, these children are available for adoption. So by that point, the opportunity for an infant, had really passed us by. Our daughter was getting older, and we thought that it was good timing for us to look into adopting an older child. And this agency, in connection with the orphanages in Mexico, was the perfect opportunity.
So for me, when I hear about adoption, sometimes you hear some very good stories, sometimes you hear some like very scary stories, right? And for me, I don't have any children, but I always thought that adoption was an option because here in Canada, we have so many children that are without parents. And you kind of have this like savior, I don't say savior complex, right? But you want to save these children from not having a family of their own because in a way that you don't have a family of your own. Was there any hesitation in proceeding this way, or was this always something that you considered to be an option for you?
No, it was something that was only introduced because of the infertility issues and that we wanted a larger family. And honestly, that's why I started writing the books, because the reality of what we experienced in that maybe perhaps you've heard this, every adoption begins with trauma. So there's something called the primal wound, and that's what I, given my daughter's experience, I began to look into this. And the actual separation of the child from the birth mother begins kind of the traumatic experience for the child. So our daughter had it kind of two times over because we adopted her at age 6, almost 7. So she, lost all touch with her homeland, the sights, the sounds, the food, the caregivers, the environment. It was all so different. And, I really didn't, I'll say, appreciate all that she had lost. I didn't recognize the extent of this trauma. And so years later, when I reflected back on it and began writing, I'm just passionate about this mission with uh, connecting with other adoptive families to open this discussion about trauma and have children express what they're thinking and feeling as they're growing up in families um, where they're thinking about their birth mother and their creation story. Where do they come from?
I've heard from a few couples the impact of infertility on their relationship. Some people believe that it's their fault and they get very discouraged and very upset in regards to it. And a lot of people feel shame. And I know that when I speak to the couples about it, it seems that it impacts men one way, impacts women another way. And this is not even determining who's the source of the infertility issues. But I know it could bring a lot of stress, a lot of uneasiness, a lot of we don't talk about that in the household. When it was discovered that there are some infertility issues within your relationship, what were some of the emotions that your family were experiencing during that time?
Well, you hit the nail right on the head. I mean, you're very close to describing the range of emotions. It's it's a very isolating and depressing time, no matter what the cause. I mean, lots of couples go through it, but at the time, you're thinking that you're the only one that's going through it. So it's very um, it's very hard to deal with because of the ups and downs. There are so many uh, medical interventions that can happen depending on what the issues are. And your hopes are raised, and then they're dashed, they're raised, and then they're dashed, and perhaps there's things in the future, uh, IVF or surgery, or there's always these other things to try, and it just becomes this long, um, very unforgiving path that couples have to go through and just maintain some sort of positivity, and it's very difficult.
I don't think, sometimes I wonder if the impact of it is truly ever measured because you can have it, let's say, midway through your relationship, depending on your age or your health at that point. But even if you were to overcome the scenario, such as you did with the adoption, do you think it ever leaves the person's mental state? Like, do they ever get through it, or is it something that stays with them for a period of time?
Well, I think that really depends on the outlook of the individual, and how there are all sorts of things that come into play: ability to be resilient, and if a subsequent decision is made to adopt, so much energy is poured into that the effects of the infertility and the kind of the inward focus on that sort of dissipates, because all your focus and energy is on that child that you're bringing into your family.
And then you can somehow move on between the two people involved. What were some of the things that you guys did to move forward outside of the adoption? Like, what were some of the conversations between the two of you, or even, let's say, designing the path to go from the infertility to the adoption and continue with your life?
Well, we made the decision, but even it was an international adoption. But it's funny, even though you make the decision, you're completing all the paperwork, which includes interviews and reference checks and psychological tests and reading and training. So it's all a very busy time, but a very stressful time, because you're really at the mercy of the laws and practices of another country. And within, for instance, Mexico, there were different issues with the different states, and one, I think, cut off adoptions for a period of time, and it was very traumatic for the couples waiting for that particular state within Mexico. So it was very uncertain. It's so interesting that you never felt like the decision was, oh, thank goodness that's over. Everything was pins and needles, tentative, nerves, frayed nerves, and it was not until the final paperwork came through that you could breathe easier. It's a very stressful, it's extremely stressful.
What did you learn about yourself during that whole experience?
Well, it was something that I could compartmentalize because I was working full time. We already had a daughter, and I needed my energies for some of these other things. So I was able to focus, because if I didn't and I thought too much about perhaps what could go wrong or whether we would be approved with, in time to do X, Y, and Z, or whether we would get the right training or schedule again, at the mercy of Mexico. At one point, we were waiting to schedule something, and, they have holidays and people were out, and it just seemed to drag on forever. So, I found out that I was able to focus and devote the time and energy that I needed for my current family, and while preparing for the new family. So it's stressful and taxing, but it's also very affirming that you're able to get through it.
So there's sometimes where like the family will, or the sorry, the couple, let's say in this case, like a husband and wife, for example, right? And they're looking to make this decision, which in a lot of ways it's a big decision because at least over here, you would have to qualify to adopt someone. And as you mentioned, right, there's certain rules and regulations and laws you have to abide by. Whereas if you're going to have, let's say, a biological child, you have sex, 9 months later, surprise, congratulations. Life kind of goes on. And when you mentioned that since it was an international adoption, and I'm guessing there was different things that you had to go by. Were you surprised at, well, I guess let me ask it this way. How did you feel about the process of the adoption,
Mhm.
it being international, and maybe the difference between if it was more local or domestic?
Well, at the time, I was much more connected with the requirements of various countries and agencies and domestic versus international. And from my recollection, I will say that Mexico had many extra layers of requirements, psychological testing, reference checks, and things that were not required of other countries. So it was, um, it was an exercise in patience, because uh, I never felt it was for the children. There was no expediency or effort on the part of Mexico to to find children's homes. It was more, well, what, are all your paperwork in the right order? In fact, in one of our trips to Mexico, we spent all day actually at the U.S. Embassy getting our paperwork in order, only to be told at the last minute that the papers were just not in the correct order. So our entire plan was delayed a full day just to reorder the staple. And everything stopped, and we had to call the translator back, and she had to reorder things. It just seemed, so much ado about nothing, when really it was the children that we were concerned about, and there didn't seem to be much focus on the correct things, in my view.
How do you think that impacted you and your family during that time?
Well, again, an exercise in patience, because you're in another country, you're trying to abide by their rules to satisfy what's needed to create the family that you want. So we, made we had enough, we had the resources to be flexible, and we had taken off the time, and we had 3 trips to Mexico. For 2 of the trips, we did bring our other daughter. So we just were in a position to do whatever it took. Again, you're really at the mercy of what other countries require, and that's somewhat the reason that international adoptions have really fallen off in the U.S. Most of the adoptions are family adoptions or foster to adopt. There's been so much fraud and issues with declaring children as quote unquote orphans, and the fees associated with some of these transactions. So it's been a difficult road for many families. I'm sure they could, if people listening could understand that.
It's for me on the outside looking in. This is something I really wanted to do, and I'm meeting roadblock after roadblock after roadblock. I would feel a bit anxious, maybe a little, maybe even a bit disappointed, maybe even a bit frustrated. Outside of the process and the international, it's like I want to do this because I think it's going to benefit my family overall, as well as I'm doing a good deed. I'm taking someone out of a situation and I'm looking to improve it in a lot of ways, right? I have a lot of love to give, I have a lot of resources to give. I have a lot of, which is the most precious gift in the world, a lot of time to give this young child. And I guess that's what I mean when I say that. How did it impact you and your family? Because this is something that everyone wanted to do at that point in time, but you're meeting certain delays. Do you think it had an impact on, let's say, the overall mental health of yourself and maybe others who are looking to have this process completed as soon as possible as well?
Well, we were honestly we were not quite prepared for the I don't know, the complexities of all the requirements. But I think that's part of, couples tell themselves, we have the time, we have the resources, we have the love to give. That's part of the myth of adoption, that all that being present uh, in the child's life, then everything is okay. And people used to tell us all the time, "Oh, your daughter's so lucky. She's so lucky to have you as a family." And that's really, kind of a problematic scenario nowadays, because there's so much trauma, really, as part of the adoption experience for the child, because they're expected to be grateful. They're expected to recognize that their lives are better. And, in many instances, parents, it's the same as your biological child. As parents are sometimes very good at parenting and sometimes they are not. So it's a challenge. And there are many adoptees that feel that adoption should be abolished, which is a very interesting uh, position to think about. But so not everyone is in favor, even with, I am not one of those. I am an adoption advocate. I think it is, creating a family for a child is better than living in an orphanage. That's that's my basis for comparison, and that's where I've come out.
I'm glad you mentioned that because that's something that maybe a lot of people wouldn't know is that they're doing this and they're immediately thinking that they're going to be the ones to save this child, to improve everything. This child is going from whatever scenario that they're in to as soon as I adopt them, they're going to become perfect. They're going to be the next president, right? They're going
Right.
to be they're going to cure world hunger. Because of this child, there's going to be no more disease, right? Why do you think so many people have that view of the adoption process?
Well, I think we've been set up since, oh geez, since the beginning of time, the beginning of the entertainment industry, beginning with Orphan Annie and everyone, Anne of Green Gables and Harry Potter and Lemony Snicket and Cinderella. And I mean, there's a million stories out there that portray an orphan as someone needing love, so deserving of love. And when that family uh, becomes known and embraces that child, that all those problems are solved. So that's been a trope that, has been, Disney has just misrepresented adoption for years. And so families kind of buy into that, thinking all those thoughts that you just outlined. And, that's not really the case because of the trauma that I mentioned. And So it's very difficult when things don't go as planned for families to um, to accept that behavior. So that's one of the reasons that I began writing my books, because one of the very unique things that I do with my books is introduce the concept of trauma. What are the triggers? What are the questions that children are asking? And how can we address this with children, adopted children, perhaps foster children, and stepchildren? How can we address these issues so that blended families thrive? So I kind of expanded my narrative here to talk a little bit more about children coming into new scenarios, unique families, blended families, because children all want to know their story. You know, how did I get here? Who do I look like? Uh, what was my first family like? Why am I? Why was I adopted? Why was I given up? Why did she give me away? All of those questions need to be addressed and answered. And the story, the adoption story, needs to be told to children even before the concept of adoption is understood. So that's kind of the unique mission of my books, because many of them have lovely stories about love and embracing and joining a family. But I think acknowledging this trauma and the questions that children have around their identity is equally as important.
When do you think, actually, I'll take a step back. That type of conversation, is that a difficult conversation to have with the child? And when should we have that conversation?
Well, again, I think depending on the age of the child, but the story of how that child has entered into the family should be told early and often is what I say. So of course your parents will be choosing age appropriate words, but that story will grow and develop and be details added as the child grows. So it's very important for the subject to be addressed immediately, because the child is thinking that. When we were first adopting, my daughter was excuse me, 7 years old when she was adopted, and my biological child was 8 years old. So when we would go places, people would ask us, "Are they sisters? They don't look alike." They're so everyone has something to say, and we live in a world where a lot of people have no filters, and children obviously have, they can see that, and she knew. She went to sleep one evening in Mexico, and then the next day she was in suburban Philadelphia. So that's a pretty big shock. So, but I want to step back for a moment and say that trauma happens even when children are adopted as infants. Of course, the stories are different. The sequencing of details presented to that child are different, but it's important to have that story front and center for each child. Our daughters had two very different experiences, and we were as honest as we could be. But that's the reason I decided to write the books, is because I don't think that I had as full an appreciation of her experience and her trauma. And I wanted to open the doors and open the conversations, encourage those conversations with families using my books.
So you mentioned the books and you mentioned how you shared the journey and the story. What would you like your readers to take away from the book, from the stories, from the journey?
Well, there are three children's picture books for children approximately age 4 to 8, depicting scenarios and events that all happened within our own family, but they're not specifically about our family, because my daughters would kill me if I wrote any more about them. So I can't write about them. They said, "Enough, Mom." So I think the scenarios presented in the book um, are, well, first of all, difficult questions and conversations as well as triggers. So, and by that I mean one of the first assignments that my daughter had in her young life in second grade was to put together a family tree. Well, she had just um, flown in from Mexico to be a part of our family and didn't really know our family. And so we worked together to introduce her to people and do the best job that we could. But sometimes a child's birthday, a family tree, going shopping and having someone ask, why don't your two daughters look the same? So all of these things are scenarios and incidents that I raise in my books. And I think that provides an environment for, or a safe space for parents to raise those issues to children and ask, is this something that you've been thinking about, or this happened to us, or you did your family tree in Mrs. Smith's class the other day, so let's work on that. So it's really kind of based on our experience, and with the hope that the conversations get a little easier. And I'll just say one more thing. One thing that happens, and I've heard this from many other adoptive families, is that there are bound to be, tensions and anger and frustrations and trauma recovery, and hearing, you're not my real father, you're not my real mother, I hate you, and those kinds of things are going to happen. And I have that in one of my books. Again, that's the trauma talking, and that's the ability to, as a child is really sorting out who they are, where they came from, who they look like, what does their first mom look like, and getting used to a whole nother family and life.
I think if I look at parents, and when you have two children, three children, or you have two or more, there's always going to be maybe a little bit of a struggle between the family dynamic because one child is so used to getting things a certain way, like all the attention, right? And then
Right.
you introduce another child or even a dog sometimes. And I can see that in some families where, the dog gets all the love, it gets all the kisses, it gets all the cuddles. And then there's like an imbalance, at least in the beginning, because everyone's getting used to a different family setup. I couldn't imagine the difficulty or maybe the perceived difficulty where you're taking a child that maybe is aware on a subconscious level that there's another parent out there for them, but now they're here in a situation where they're trying to make the best of it, even though they're still very young. Right. And you mentioned some of the difficulties, some of the triggers. Share with our audience what are some of the early struggles or the early triggers, maybe for the child as well as the parents in that situation.
Sure. Well, things that, and it was not consistent. Let's just say that it was not a matter of, during my daughter's first 10 years of living with us, it was all misery. It was really a mix of emotions: good, bad, happy, sad. And but understanding those triggers and being ready for those conversations when they happen are all part of it. So one thing that we did, together as a family, making food and dinners, uh, keeping in touch with those women from her past and her culture, keeping that um, keeping that alive for her. It was very quick for her to lose her Spanish. So she came to the U.S., of course, speaking Spanish fluently, and the loss was reflected really in her whole personality. So it wasn't until middle school when Spanish instruction started again, where she began to hear it. And then, it started to come back, which was really magical. And eventually, high school, college, she perfected it. And now she's fluent once again, of course. And that was really important to her. We tried to support that over time through the years, but it takes a lot to relearn a language, and it did happen. It did happen for her gradually. So I don't know, did I answer that question? But it was really a mix of things. But it was important to, and we knew it was important. We stayed in touch with the women that were important to her in Mexico, and we're still in touch with them today.
I guess, Anna Maria, as we close, what advice do you want to give um, men and women who are looking to adopt and there's a level of uncertainty in their life because they don't know what to expect, but you want to help to ease any thoughts or any strong initial emotions that they may have?
Well, I think for me, the three of the most important things. First, I don't know whether network is the right word, but adoption agencies have support groups, information, and so get in touch with, or just perhaps through your church or a neighborhood, families that have adopted. So it's really important. Sit down with them, have a coffee, find out what their experience was, and you'll hear the story straight, unfiltered. So that's really, really important. The second thing is, as I mentioned, that I did, and perhaps even waited a little bit too long to do, uh, do a complete research. Now, our adoption was over 20 years ago, before internet. I had a phone book, and I was calling every entry under A and getting information from agencies, from people, going to libraries. But there's so much online in terms of adoption coaches, adoption agencies that provide grants that help with the expenses. It's tremendously expensive. So there are so many resources out there. I have some listed on my website. And then professionals. Once we adopted our daughter, we had the opportunity to connect with therapists and professionals, providing a space, a time and a space for her to speak to others besides her parents. We don't have all the answers, and sometimes it was easier for her to talk to someone else. And that's just a fact. And I think those things together really present an informed position for parents to make decisions. Should they, shouldn't they, what domestic, international,